Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Robots Are Coming, episode 1. I'm really excited to showcase our very first episode. I'm Ken, undergraduate student at UC Berkeley. I'm from San Jose, California. And here's Michael.
I'm Michael. I'm a college student at Stanford right now. I'm originally from China, where I went to high school in. Now I'm here back in the States. We're excited to be the co-hosts of the Robots Are Coming podcast. And this is our very first episode. So Ken, what are we going to talk about this very first episode?
So for our very first episode, we're going to be talking about, our motivations for starting this podcast and our backgrounds in, within the Yang Gang. And what the Yang Gang is a group of individuals who, were followers of this presidential candidate named Andrew Yang. And also we'll end off with our outlook for the future of technology. Anything to add,
Yeah,
Michael?
and, don't be mistaken somehow that this podcast or this episode is going to be about politics. Young people aren't really interested in that, and we're not here to promote Yang. There's no point because his campaign ended, but uh, we're not going to be exclusively talking about it, but rather how listening to Yang's message led us to uh, this podcast and how some of those motivations transferred over. So obviously, you can tell we are Yang supporters, and it's actually the thread by which we first got introduced. It was at a fundraiser event for Andrew Yang, I think back in February or so. So it's quite a while ago. But for the purpose of this episode, we'll talk about how Yang inspired us and what that has to do with the future of technology and how that led us to found this podcast. But don't worry, in the future episodes, we won't be talking about Yang too much, if at all.
Yeah. So I can just start off with let's see, how did we meet, right? So it was at this Yang fundraiser in San Francisco, and Andrew Yang was having one of his few fundraisers in which he was raising money for his campaign in Iowa, and he came to SF, and we both came to this event, and I guess this event was where Andrew came out, greeted us, and he told us about his outlook on the future of technology, and I think that was like one of the few things that led us to meeting each other, and also like led us to like being more inspired to talk about technology, talk about like the future of politics and all that. Do you have anything to add, Michael?
Yeah, uh, I think our individual support for Yang definitely dated back uh, a lot longer. By the time we met, we were already very fervent Yang supporters. We were already convinced by Yang. But obviously, everyone has a stage where uh, they didn't support Yang or they were very skeptical of Yang. So I think a natural place to start is to trace back to before we were Yang supporters. What led us, how we got introduced to the name Andrew Yang, and what led us to convert ourselves into Yang supporters. So yeah, so Ken, when did you first hear about Andrew Yang?
Yeah, so I was a little bit late to the whole Yang Gang situation. So I actually only discovered him really in around the summer of 2019. So I was really late into the game, and how I discovered him, it was through YouTube videos. Just seeing this Asian American man like running for president, and that really um, caught my eye, and I didn't think anything of him until I took a look at his book, The War on Normal People. I took a read through it, and The War on Normal People is essentially a book written by Andrew Yang that talks about the future of work, technology, and how we really need universal basic income. And that book really inspired me to take a deeper dive into the Andrew Yang campaign. And and what Andrew talks about in terms of automation, technology, the future of work really resonated with me in particular because, I was born and bred in the heart of the Silicon Valley, which is San Jose, California. My parents kind of work in this area of biotech, and my uncle is also an electrical engineer. So I'm all around, the future of tech and technology. So all the things that Andrew was talking about really, um, you know, really like inspired me, and I guess all of these things like really checked up to my expectations of the realities of the realities of work in our country, and that's what inspired me to talk about Andrew Yang, and that's what inspired me to be one of the co-founders of the UC Berkeley Yang Gang, and that's how I got involved with Andrew Yang.
Yeah. There's a popular graphic on the internet a while back called the 7 stages of Yang.
Yeah.
Uh, and it outlines like a journey from first hearing about Andrew Yang, like it models after the 7 stages of grief or whatever, like starting from denial to skepticism, and then I think last stage is like uh, you know telling everyone, like it's a play on some psychological process, but it shows like the journey that many people go from uh, first being in denial to Andrew's message to finally accepting and then uh, spreading it to other people. So obviously it seems like your family background, your background as an Asian American, as the son of Andrew's background. But was
Yeah.
there a time when, despite that, was really skeptical of Yang's message?
Yeah, I was really skeptical of Yang's message because I didn't really know how UBI would be able to go into the mainstream. I was really worried about things like inflation, things like how we could afford it, and how it would affect work, and uh, and I was really skeptical of all of these things. And as a result, I had to look into it more, and that's what led me to reading the book "The War on Normal People," Andrew Yang's book.
Cool. Um, yeah, I guess for me it's a bit different. Um, like it wasn't necessary. Well, I mean, obviously his message really resonated eventually. Um, uh, but I think like it takes a bit more for someone to join the Yang Gang. Like obviously most people knew from the start that he didn't really have a real shot at winning. So it's sort of like you really need a internal justification, a sort of inherent motivation that leads you to continue to support Yang, despite knowing that all the odds are probably not in his favor. Uh, so I guess like that moment for me was when I first heard about Yang. It was March 2019.
Mm.
My dad sent me like an article on WeChat. He said this is a Chinese American. It's actually Taiwanese American, but the article made a mistake, running for president.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I looked into some of the articles and I was super skeptical. Like what the heck? I never took an interest in UBI or much of the any of politics throughout my whole life. So at the start, I thought it had nothing to do with me. But then I was going through a pretty tough period emotionally back then, and um, I think the more I listened to his message, I saw like a really good person in him. Like he wasn't just a very smart policymaker. Uh, he was also a very decent human being, and especially if you put him in contrast with Donald Trump, and what you picture as a politician sort of personality, someone who's like hypocritical, lying, possibly manipulative, subject to bribes. Like Andrew didn't have any of that. he was like a really clean slate. And I think like just from learning about him as a person uh, went a long way for me to support him. And then eventually uh, I took an interest in obviously the same things that he did, which is it obviously had a lot of relevance to my career aspirations in tech and AI. Uh, but that certainly wasn't the only reason. It was definitely uh, hearing about him at the right time in my
Yeah.
life that led me ultimately to cement a really strong uh, conviction that he was the kind of person we should have leading the country.
Yeah, and what do you mean by hearing him at the right time in your life, Michael? Can you elaborate more on that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, it was in March uh, 2019, so it was the winter quarter freshman year, and at the time I was really depressed because I had a terrible relationship that ended, and my ex, you know, I frequently refer to her as my demonic ex because there just isn't any other adjective I could use to describe, uh, her. It was a really terrible end to their relationship, and uh, during that winter, I was obviously depressed, lonely, anxious, uh, and I felt like I really lost this sense of touch with reality. And at the start, I really blamed myself. Like I thought it's just something that I have to get over with because like most people still continue on with their lives as normal, right? Like they sort of adapt to reality and they uh, change themselves. Maybe they hook up with someone new after the end of a relationship, and like everything just moves on. But then Andrew's message was essentially we cannot accept the status quo. Like the status quo is exactly why we are seeing all these problems. Like it's not just Donald Trump is a really bad person. It's some of all the structural uh, systems in place that led to Donald Trump being elected. America is not okay, and there's all these problems at work. Like that sort of way of thinking is one I could really resonate to because, like, uh, because when I reflect on my relationship or like some of the things I went through in my life, it wasn't just one person who came out and like tried to hurt me. She herself was the product of a lot of systemic problems, coming from China. For example, like the government, the education system, the you know the uh, gender problems, uh, the economic problems, all the sort of uh, all the problems in China, like really really caused who she was. And then coming to the U.S., you see, even though the U.S. operated on a very different system, it sort of allowed me to see the merits and flaws of both systems, and then how someone like me or her who didn't feel like we belonged in either could really sort of fall through the cracks and not feel like we belonged to either. uh, and that sort of analysis was one I did by myself, and it was one that Andrew was very very good at. So just hearing Andrew speak and the way he fought, like I learned a lot, uh, and it ultimately helped me through a very rough emotional period in my life. Yeah, so that's the elaborated version.
Yeah, and what Andrew does talk a lot about is really questioning the status quo, right? And I truly believe like the things that Andrew was saying about changing how our current system is run, how changing our current capitalistic society is run, turning into human-centered capitalism, um, you know, changing the systems that we have in place in China or even maybe in America as well. I think that's really important for progress, um, and making sure that every single American and every single person receives like the same opportunity. I think that's what Andrew was saying with a lot of his, policies. And I think that's what brought me to Andrew as well. And I think that's kind of what you were getting at, right? Like his solutions were very, solutions based, and he was about solving the problems directly, and, not necessarily talking about, how Donald Trump caused all these problems. Rather, he was a product of all of these country, right? Donald Trump was a product of the systematic buildup of, oppression, of economic inequality, of all of these things, culminating all together to the point where, he eventually became our president. And that's kind of how, I guess, your relationship kind of came to be. And I guess I could see how Andrew kind of fits into that.
And I think uh, like at least for me, when I really learned about Andrew and I got to learn more about him, like I could see that he's been through some pretty rough things in the past as well. In his book he talks about growing up in New York, getting bullied as the often the only Asian kid in the class, and his experience growing up, helping the underdogs, and his motivation to founding different organizations and now running for president. So you could tell, like, from his experiences as a past, led to who he was today, who he is today. And it's obvious that served as, I look to that as like a guiding beacon that I could use in my life. If I could relate to his past, then maybe in the future I could seek to emulate his journey and find lessons in them. Yeah.
And in his book he talks about, being one of the few Asian kids in his classrooms, and I think that like really shaped into the person who he is, like really wanting to help the underdog. And I guess that's what led him to create many of his policies, like UBI, like human-centered capitalism, like Medicare for all. All of these policies are around the idea that he believes that every single American, every single human being has some sort of intrinsic value. And that's something I kind of look toward as well. I'm really, about helping the underdog, making sure that everyone gets a really big chance to, thrive. And I think that is really important. And like on a personal level, the led me to Andrew Yang was, I think, my mom in the summer of 2019. She also lost her job and that that was what really solidified as well my personal journey to Andrew Yang, and really looking more into his policies as well.
Yeah, I guess, for me it's very similar. My mom actually works contract jobs, and she's sort of a workaholic, and she's all about money. Like her last name in Chinese is actually Qian, which translates to money. And so my maternal family, my grandpa, who recently passed away, it's a funny story, but it sort of tells you some of the problems in China. So my grandpa lives by himself, right? When my mom left to the U.S. for work, my grandpa essentially had to be left behind, and he was living by himself. And because my mom didn't have enough savings to hire like a maid or like some sort of a ayi in China, like someone to just clean the house and look after my grandpa. She didn't have the savings to do that, which ended up causing my grandpa to one day getting a heart attack, and there was nobody to help him. And even adding insult to injury, when my grandpa, just weeks before my grandpa passed away, he was at the stock trading community center. Like it's a place where people like trade stocks and they can buy and sell. And it was my grandpa's like one of his favorite hobbies. Like even as he became really old, he likes trading stocks all the time, and trying to earn more money. And so one day when he was at the stock trading center, there was a fraud who approached him and essentially sounded very sounded like he had a lot of expertise on the stocks, and persuaded my grandpa to lend him a lot of his money. And then afterwards, even though he gave a contact, he sort of just disappeared, and my grandpa never found him again. So he lost a huge chunk of money because of to that fraud, and he actually died still having no resolution, still having no resolution to that incident. So you can see like some of the problems in China. It was actually one of the last major incidents to happen in his life, and he had to die like that. So it was a really terrible tragedy. Coupled with his heart attack, and there was no one around him to even people working in Silicon Valley should care about the rest of the country. And if that's in your selfish interest to help out the poor, then you might as well feel good about yourself for doing so. So that's my message to the listeners of this podcast, and what I think should be emphasized more often. Okay.
Yeah, I think what he's really saying transcends what's happening both in the U.S. and interestingly in what's happening in China. I didn't know that, and that was really cool that what he's talking about really resonates with people not only in America but around the world as well. And hopefully, even though he didn't win, even though Andrew didn't necessarily get the presidency, hopefully like a lot of his policies and a lot of what he's saying really sheds a light into a lot of the problems that are in our society today, but also, we can start thinking about solutions as to how we can solve a lot of these things, right? And especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, where, every single person right now is just, affected in some form or another, whether economically, or, through a loss of job or health-wise. I think it's really important that we address a lot of these things now, even after his presidency had ended, especially with the fact that, the problems that he was still talking about, the fact that 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, a large majority of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency bill. I think a lot of these things still exist, and I think it's up to, not only us, but our viewers to think about how we can move the torch forward in terms of, politics or tech or whatever we do, because the problems are still certainly there, right? And it's only up to all of us to really push forward.
Yeah, I would. Yeah. So I think now to transition on the topic of technology and why, and how supporting Andrew Yang led us to starting this podcast.
Yeah.
I think, yes. So perhaps like I'll give my general thought process as to how like this, how like what led me to. Wait, I cut this part out. I guess. So I'll try to lay out my sort of internal justification as to why I'm devoting the effort to do this podcast, specifically on technology and what technology has to do about you know, supporting Andrew Yang, how it's a way for me to continue supporting Yang after his candidacy ended. So obviously, I care a lot about the problems that Andrew Yang described, and the problems that we'll talk a lot about in the podcast, like the statistics that Ken mentioned. But I think where technology comes into place is technology for me is it's sort of universal in a sense that it applies both in China and the U.S. So going back to like how I think Yang stands for a set of ideas that are more universal in nature. I've always looked at technology as a sort of universal language that everyone can share all over the world, and the progress of technology is truly universal, and generally we want technology to have a positive impact on society. But obviously in the U.S. that it doesn't look like that might necessarily be the case, even though I think from our bubbles, like the general attitude towards technology is very optimistic, especially in Silicon Valley. The reality is that it's causing a lot of these structural issues, and I guess like I can sort of see this better because in China there's a lot of the same problems. There's still many people living in poverty who don't have access to bank accounts, who aren't very proficient in technology, and even things like using online learning, like especially people in the very poor areas of China. But then you can now see that many of those problems, the way China has dealt with those problems, are much better than how the U.S. is doing with its sort of social problems. China has really, in my mind, adopted technology across the entire country at a much faster rate than the U.S. has, and you could see that especially in the major cities. The younger generation are all very tech savvy. Like almost all of them can, use a whole set of. All of them are like very active consumers in the market. They can use services like Didi, like the Uber of China, like the Yelp of China, and they can all use them. And part of it is like by the way China has pushed technology, they sort of unify everything in one single app called WeChat. And WeChat allows you to, do all your finances, find restaurants, chat, purchase things, even like request services or like dental appointments. Like it's sort of a one-size-fit-all app that allows everyone to be very fluent in using its services. Whereas in the U.S., because of sort of the free market dynamics, it's every country is sort of competing each other and tearing at each other's throats. And you could see the result of this hyper-capitalistic competition not ending very well for the people at the bottom who are not part of the middle or upper class, who are able to be educated enough and tech savvy enough to make use of those benefits. So you can see the sort of the two systems at play. And even though technology itself is like a universal language that should be the same everywhere in the world, you can see as the result of the systems in place, the impact is very different in the US and in China. So that's sort of what led me to thinking like a podcast like this one that unites both the technologists and the people who are interested in politics and just the impact of technology, how they could try to understand what the connections are and how we can better design policies that would allow more Americans to reap the benefits of progress.
Yeah, and I definitely agree that more Americans need to reap the benefits of progress of technology. I think especially as a UC Berkeley student, I've talked to, engineers who are developing self-driving cars, automated kiosks, and food delivering robots. And that's eventually going to transform the landscape of work, both in where we're both from, the Silicon Valley and the rest of America. And I think right now, currently, most Americans, operate on this mindset of scarcity as we're living from paycheck to paycheck. And, because of this mindset of scarcity, we struggle with time, empathy, money, and mental health in some form or another. And, a lot of these advancing technology should solve many of these, prevailing problems, but our mental health is declining. Drug overdoses are increasing, and income inequality is at an all-time high. And, the perils of automation is, really close. And I think it's up to us to show, you guys, the viewers, what's in store for, the rest of the country, and what, the Silicon Valley is up to, right?
I think, that's a very good point. For the viewers of this podcast, they're all probably going to be techies and people who are very well off, and they can definitely live a very good upper middle class life, being software engineers at different companies, or just staying in the valley, which is really where the innovation, the progress is happening. But for the viewers, they might think, why should I care about what's happening in Iowa or Kansas or all those rural states? So Ken, why do you think the viewers of this podcast should care about the plights of of people from those states, the rest of the country?
Yeah, right. I think a lot of people who are in tech create a lot of the things that will inevitably control and distribute power, because what software engineers are able to build will affect people from Iowa, from Kansas, and hopefully with our podcast we can show, there are boundaries that we have to make in what we build, and there's also a lot of, political, ethical, social underpinnings of the things that we build and the things that we engineer. And I think that's really important, because in my opinion, to me, whoever has the power to build things is able to, affect society in a really monumental way. For example, the people who are things as basic as Facebook or Twitter, or a lot of the things that we use every day, are controlling what we read, what we have, and I guess what kind of power we have as a society. And I think that's really important, because technology is advancing at such a high and fast rate, and the rest of the country really need to learn about this.
Pause. Uh, wait. Are all the previous recordings stored?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think a better format is we continue to. So I ask a question, you ask a question, and sort of bounce back and forth.
Oh, okay.
I think that's a better format, because once you finish making a point, the other person should be able to transition in.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay, continue.
I mean, Michael, in your opinion, why do you think people in tech should care about what happens to, what happens in Kansas or Iowa?
Yes, so I would, on top of all the valid points you made, I would make a further argument as to why techies should care for the plights of the rest of the country. Because in my experience, some of the techies I talk to, they're very aware of the impact that and the negative impact they're causing to the rest of the country, that perhaps, you know, uh, uh, the Amazon's share price might not really be correlated to the well-being of the average Joe. And in fact, they're very well aware that it's actually inversely correlated. You know, the better Amazon's doing, the more brick and mortar stores are closing, the more malls are closing. They're very aware of these facts. But, you know, for many people, they're just not, you know, to be frank, they just don't care about the plight of, you know, rural Americans. Like, you know, they've had it well their whole lives, and uh, they don't first they don't really feel the same pain as the others do. They don't have that ability to empathize. Or second, they might think, you know, it's not really my responsibility. You know, my job is to make things work faster, more efficient. That's sort of how techies really think about the world. You know, it's all about efficiency, speed, you know, and all those quantitative metrics that as long as they make things run better, faster, that it should, you know, someone else would take care of the harder work of making sure it actually creates positive impact. So I think that's the general sentiment amongst some of the techies I talk to. They're not like bad people. They're just minding their own business. But you know, they don't necessarily feel a sense of duty or responsibility to help out the average American. But I would make the additional argument why they should care. I think there's a very selfish incentive actually to make sure that the rest of the country is keeping up with uh, with the Silicon Valley and the Wall Street of the world, and it's because eventually all those negative damage that's caused in those communities will compound, and the more they compound, the more, you know, it's eventually going to come back in the form of taxes that you have to pay, in the form of you know, the regulations by which your company is operating, and you know, this cycle of negative impact is going to perpetuate itself back to you, even the people who are doing the best. And recently, I read this article that talks about how the question of race in the past few decades, and the article says race has always been the factor as to why America has underinvested itself so much in the past few decades. And it is because the ruling class, who are mostly whites, doing very well, they sort of use racism to blame many of the problems of society on the minority groups, on the African Americans, on the Latinos, on the immigrants, to be frank. And that's why Donald Trump's message really caught a lot of attention, is that even though his solutions are totally garbage, the fact that he found an explanation to many of the problems that Americans are facing was very appealing. You know, it's really easy to use the motif of race to find the explanation to the problems of society. And the article I read essentially says, because of this racism amongst the whites, amongst white America, America has consistently underinvested in itself, because the whites don't necessarily want the best of the country. They just want the best of themselves relative to everyone else. So as long as even if the country is going downhill, as long as they have the upper ground relative to the Hispanics, the Latinos, you know, as long as they are able to project that contempt towards the other minority groups and feel superior, they would that would be all, you know, they would care about. Like, they would be complacent with that. And you know, sort of the long run impact of this way of thinking of this racism, of systemic racism, is underinvestment in all the public institutions, in all the, you know, in healthcare, in education, in the state budgets, and in the long run, everything sort of goes downhill. But the article, I think, makes a really valid point that in order for us to turn this around, even the ruling class, even the people who are doing very well, they have a selfish incentive to invest in the country, and to rebuild these public institutions for all Americans, because it's eventually going to haunt them in the long run if they don't do so.
Yeah, that's why it's really important for this podcast to come into fruition, because hopefully we can educate whoever is listening to understand our point of view and share our thoughts on not only the future of technology, but also the impacts that it'll have for the rest of the country. And hopefully we can make a better future for us all. And I think the future, in my opinion, it will be bright if we if the progress of technology is shared by everyone, and hopefully if you tune in, we'll give that path forward. Michael, what do you think that we could provide to the listener or the viewer that will create a better future?
I think I guess I think like our ideal goal for the podcast isn't to turn all of our viewers into activists or advocates or Yang supporters. Like, we obviously don't expect that of you, of all the techies listening to this podcast. We sort of just want to first make sure like you understand what's really going on in the country, that and sort of the limitations in our worldview from being in this bubble of Silicon Valley, or of amongst the technology innovation center of the country, and how that contrasts with the rest of the country, but also perhaps point to different possible inspirations that you could draw and you could take away into your work and into your lives. And we have just in this episode we've talked about our inspirations to caring so much about this topic, but in the upcoming episodes we'll interview people from a wide variety of careers who are doing a wide variety of work related to technology, and their journeys will be different, and perhaps you'll find more resonance in some of their journeys, and hopefully by the end of this episode you'll have at least some of the guests or us or Andrew Yang to turn to if you ever need inspiration or desire to find meaning in your work in the technology sector.
Yeah.
So I think that's our goal for the podcast.
Yeah, we hope you enjoy, and we're happy to continue this podcast, and it'll inspire more thought into how technology will affect all of us, but also ways that we can improve the lives of everyday Americans. And we hope you enjoy. Any lasting words left, Michael, before we sign off?
If you want to come on the podcast, if you're like a future Elon Musk in the making, we'll love to have you on, and we'll love to hear your thoughts.
Well, you don't have to be a future Elon Musk. You can be, just a regular Joe who's interested in coming on, because we're interested in in perspectives from, across political spectrum, across race, across religion, gender, everything. So we're just really looking forward to hearing diverse perspectives. And yeah, Michael.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out if you agree, disagree, want to share your perspective to some of the things we will discuss in the podcast. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah. All right. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you tune in. Please subscribe on our YouTube channel or listen on any of our other means through Spotify, Apple, and yeah.
Cool.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.